Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore a topic that's mysterious, fascinating, and deeply profound. You might not believe it, but what's about to unfold could change the way you see a part of history and belief systems we've never truly examined. One small warning: you might not be able to see what you know the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment your location and local time below. I love seeing where you're tuning in from and hearing your thoughts on this topic. Now relax and let's begin our journey of discovery together. Imagine for a moment the power of belief. Think about the way gods shape nations, guide people, and influence generations. You know the names, the gods we all grew up learning about. But what if I told you there are gods that have been erased from our history, hidden from view, deliberately removed from the sacred stories we hold dear? Gods that once reigned supreme, shaping entire civilizations, and yet their names remain buried in the shadows. What would happen if these forgotten deities came back to light, demanding our attention, our reverence, and perhaps even our understanding of ourselves? You might be asking, what gods? And the answer might surprise you. I'm talking about the black gods, the powerful divine beings worshipped by ancient African, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Sumerian civilizations. These were not just mythical figures. They were the center of entire spiritual and cultural systems, shaping the lives of millions. Yet over time, their presence was wiped out, erased from history, and replaced by a single, dominating deity. The story of these black gods has been hidden, altered, and manipulated by the very forces that shaped modern religion as we know it. So, as we begin this journey tonight, think of what you've been taught about divinity, about the gods you've heard about in Sunday school, in books, in stories passed down from generation to generation. What if those stories, those names, are not the whole truth? What if the truth is something far deeper, far more ancient, and perhaps more disruptive than we've ever imagined? Buckle up, because we're about to reveal a hidden history that could transform the way you think about religion, history, and spirituality forever. Let's take a step back into ancient history, a time long before the rise of Christianity and Islam, when the gods of Africa, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Sumer held supreme power. These weren't just deities created out of stories or myths. They were the guiding forces of entire cultures, civilizations, and ways of life. Imagine a world where the divine was not distant, but intimately woven into every aspect of life. These gods were not only revered, but they were the foundation of spirituality, governance, and identity for entire peoples. In ancient Egypt, for instance, the gods were everywhere, etched in the walls of temples, inscribed on monuments, and alive in the rituals of the people. Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Anubis were just a few of the many deities that embodied both creation and destruction, life and death. They weren't just stories, they were the core of Egyptian life. The pharaohs were seen as divine rulers, their power and authority directly linked to the gods they served. The temples were centers of knowledge and spirituality, and every action in society, from governance to agriculture, was intertwined with these divine figures. In Africa, beyond Egypt, gods like Olokun of the Yoruba and Bunjil of the Aboriginal peoples, with their deep spiritual and cultural roles, provided not just religious guidance, but a map for living. These gods were tied to nature, to the land, and to the people in ways we struggle to comprehend today. For the ancient African civilizations of the Nile Valley and the surrounding areas, gods were symbols of both the unseen forces and the visible world.
They were the essence of life itself, dictating seasons, harvests, and the ebb and flow of human society. In Mesopotamia and Sumer, gods like Enlil and Marduk weren't just powerful figures. They were the very embodiments of the forces that shaped the cosmos. They ruled over the heavens, the earth, and everything in between, influencing politics, economics, and human relationships. Marduk was considered the protector of Babylon and played a central role in the epic of creation, a tale of order being brought from chaos. The ancient Sumerians viewed their gods as protectors of not only their cities, but also their very way of life. What's fascinating and critical to understand is that all these gods, despite their regional and cultural variations, shared core principles. They were manifestations of natural forces, ancestors, and spiritual truths. They were not just distant deities residing on mountaintops or in the heavens. They were intimately involved in the lives of the people, dictating everything from the laws of nature to the codes of society. So, as we look back at these ancient gods and their worshippers, there is no mistaking the deep spiritual connection between humanity and the divine. These gods were not mere figures of myth. They were the bedrock upon which civilizations were built. They were as real and tangible as the food people ate, the lands they cultivated, and the rulers they obeyed. But, as we all know, history has a way of twisting itself. And as powerful as these gods were, their presence did not last forever. There was a time when these gods, these divine beings who shaped the world as we know it, were systematically erased from the pages of history. But why? Why would anyone want to remove such powerful figures from the very history they helped create?
Imagine standing in a crowded temple in ancient Babylon, or in the heart of Egypt, where the air is thick with the scent of incense and the voices of priests chanting sacred hymns to the gods. Now imagine that one day, the voices of those priests fall silent. The idols of the gods are pulled down, and a singular deity starts to reign supreme. This is where the story of the black gods takes a sharp turn, where the power of polytheism, the belief in many gods, begins to unravel in the face of monotheism. The rise of monotheism wasn't just a religious shift, it was a revolutionary transformation of how people view the divine, the cosmos, and their very existence. The monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, emerged at different points in history, but they all carried with them the same core principle. There is only one God, one omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God who rules over everything. This was a dramatic break from the ancient polytheistic systems that had thrived for millennia, systems that included the worship of black gods. The shift wasn't just theological, it was political and cultural. Monotheism, particularly the worship of Yahweh in Judaism, laid the groundwork for the domination of a single divine figure, relegating all other deities to the shadows, especially those of African descent. In many ways, it was a strategic move to consolidate power and control over the spiritual lives of individuals and entire nations. For centuries, African gods had been a central part of the spiritual and cultural life of their people. From the majesty of Egypt to the spiritual richness of West Africa, the gods of these civilizations were tied to the very fabric of daily life. But as monotheism grew in power, especially with the rise of Christianity and Islam, these gods were systematically erased from history. The very existence of African deities, gods who had once shaped the cosmos and the fate of nations, was either ignored or intentionally silenced. Monotheism's impact was profound. By replacing a vast pantheon of deities with a singular god, the connection between people and their spiritual heritage began to weaken. Entire cultures were told that their gods were false, that their beliefs were misguided, and that they had to turn to the one true God for salvation. And this wasn't just a shift in theology, it was a political and cultural act of control. By rewriting history and replacing the gods that had once been central to African life, monotheistic religions reshaped not only the divine, but also the cultural identity of entire peoples. Yahweh, as a singular figure, became more than just a god. He became a symbol of unity and control. The narrative of one god became an instrument of colonization, spreading across continents, erasing spiritual traditions, and leaving a trail of cultural destruction in its wake. Over time, the belief in many gods gave way to the worship of one, and as it did, the gods of Africa were gradually erased from collective memory. This wasn't a gradual process of religious evolution. It was a calculated campaign to stamp out the diversity of spiritual practices and beliefs that had existed for millennia. The erasure of African gods was not an accident. It was a deliberate and strategic effort to establish monotheism as the one and only truth, to replace the spiritual landscape with a uniform vision of divinity that was easier to control. So what happened to these gods? What became of the deities that once held such power, whose names were sung in temples, whose rituals were performed in honor of their greatness? They were discarded, their stories twisted or forgotten, their very existence erased in favor of a new order. The spiritual leaders of this new era were more than just priests. They were enforcers of a new narrative, a new worldview, where the existence of multiple gods was not just incorrect, but dangerous. This is the foundation of the spiritual erasure we see today. But as we dig deeper, we begin to understand the motivations behind this shift and how the divine was manipulated to serve a larger, more powerful agenda.
Imagine a world where knowledge is power, and the very stories we tell shape our reality. Now, picture that world shifting as an unseen force begins to erase entire chapters of history, rewriting the past in a way that benefits the few while silencing the many. This is exactly what happened to the black gods, the deities who once ruled ancient civilizations and were deeply embedded in the daily lives of their people. The erasure of black gods didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical process that took place over centuries, orchestrated by the very forces that sought to consolidate power and control through the spread of monotheism. But the most striking aspect of this erasure wasn't just the removal of gods from religious practices. It was the disappearance of their significance from the collective memory. It's not that these gods were simply replaced with Yahweh or any other singular deity. It's that they were made invisible, disappeared from sacred texts, from the stories of creation, from the very fabric of spiritual life. The first step in this silent erasure was to undermine the legitimacy of the gods themselves. In early religious texts, especially those that were later incorporated into the Hebrew Bible and Christian teachings, the gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer were demonized. They were no longer seen as powerful deities who shaped the world, but rather as false idols or enemies of the one true God. Instead of honoring them, these gods were vilified. Their temples were destroyed, their statues defaced, and their names erased. What was once sacred was now seen as something to be cast aside, ridiculed, or forgotten. For instance, the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt isn't just a historical account. It's a narrative of spiritual conquest. When the Israelites fled Egypt, they weren't just leaving slavery. They were also leaving behind the polytheistic beliefs that had been ingrained in their society for centuries. The gods of Egypt, gods like Ra and Osiris, were not only rejected, but their prominence in the story of the Hebrews' escape was downplayed or erased entirely. This wasn't just about rejecting foreign gods. It was about creating a new narrative, one in which the singular God of Israel could rise to the forefront. In the centuries that followed, the process of erasing black gods continued, with empires and religions rewriting history to fit their worldview. The stories of ancient gods were often buried under layers of new mythology, their places in the spiritual hierarchy replaced by the God of Abrahamic religions. In this new world, the divine began to take on a more abstract form, stripped of the rich, complex stories that had defined the lives of millions. But this was not a passive event. This erasure was actively carried out by the religious institutions and leaders who sought to control over the masses. The introduction of monotheism brought with it not just a new religion, but a new way of understanding the world, one that required the removal of all competing divine forces. And the black gods, so integral to the spiritual and cultural foundations of many civilizations, were the first to go. As this process unfolded, the very existence of these gods was systematically erased from the religious texts, cultural traditions, and collective memory. Inscriptions were defaced, temples were destroyed, and oral traditions that honored these deities were suppressed. The black gods were no longer worshipped, they were erased. Their names forgotten by all but a few, their histories buried under the weight of new dogma. Yet despite the centuries of erasure, there were always traces left behind, small fragments of a once great spiritual heritage that refused to disappear entirely. In the faces of the gods in ancient artwork, in the rituals practiced by indigenous African communities, and in the scattered legends of gods passed down through generations, the black gods continued to whisper their names into the ears of those willing to listen. Their erasure was never complete, and as we look deeper into history, we begin to uncover the hidden truths that have been waiting to be rediscovered. These gods didn't simply vanish into oblivion, they were suppressed, concealed, and distorted. The truth about their power, their role in shaping the world, and their profound influence on ancient civilizations is a story still waiting to be told. But to uncover that truth, we need to first understand the reasons behind their silence, the forces that worked tirelessly to erase them, and the cultural forces that allowed such a profound act of spiritual theft to happen.
Now, imagine you're standing at the crossroads of ancient religious traditions, witnessing a moment of profound transformation. The gods who have reigned for millennia are about to be replaced by something entirely different, a singular, all-powerful deity, one who will reshape not just spirituality, but entire cultures. This was the birth of Yahweh, and with it, the birth of a new order that sought to impose control over both the divine and the earthly realms. The rising Yahweh was not just a religious event, it was a cultural revolution, one that rewrote the spiritual laws that had governed civilizations for thousands of years. The idea of one God, Yahweh, began to replace the many gods of the African, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian pantheons. And this wasn't just a theological shift, it was a power play, a means to consolidate control over people's lives, thoughts, and beliefs. The monotheistic movement brought about by Yahweh was not an organic evolution of spirituality, but a strategic move to centralize authority, often at the cost of suppressing existing spiritual systems, especially those of African descent. The manipulation of culture to create Yahweh as the supreme God was deliberate and calculated. The people who promoted the worship of Yahweh saw the multitude of gods across Africa and the Middle East as a threat. These gods were too powerful, too decentralized, and, most importantly, too diverse. They represented different truths, different realities, and different systems of belief. But this very diversity posed a problem for those seeking to create a unified religious system. To bring about that unity, the very concept of the divine had to be redefined. Instead of acknowledging a complex polytheistic worldview where gods were seen as powerful forces of nature, life, and death, the narrative had to shift. Yahweh became the answer to this dilemma. By centralizing the divine in one omnipotent being, the new religion could control not only the spiritual lives of people, but their political and social lives as well. With Yahweh at the center, there would be no room for competing gods. But to establish Yahweh as the one true God, the existing pantheons had to be systematically erased. The gods that once commanded worship across the ancient world, the black gods of Africa, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, were either demonized or ignored altogether. The stories that surrounded these gods were rewritten or forgotten, as if they had never existed. Their temples were torn down, their shrines desecrated, and their names struck from history. In their place, Yahweh's name was written in stone, and the new religious order began to take shape. This wasn't just about replacing gods. It was about reshaping culture. The birth of Yahweh as the sole deity was more than a religious shift. It was an attempt to create a new cultural identity, one that could be imposed on every aspect of society. Monotheism through Yahweh became the spiritual foundation of empires and nations. It was a tool for political unification, and its spread became as much about controlling people as it was about preaching faith. Yet there was an irony in this. While Yahweh's followers sought to create a singular unified Godhead,
They were essentially erasing the very diversity that once defined human spirituality. By removing the gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer, the rich tapestry of divine influence across the ancient world was replaced by one God, one story, and one truth. The gods who had once shaped the destinies of entire civilizations were now regarded as false idols or relics of a bygone age. But even as Yahweh took hold, something remained. Beneath the surface of this religious shift, the deep connection to the African gods was not entirely severed. It was buried, yes, but not forgotten. And over time, these black gods began to resurface, not in the temples or sacred texts, but in the whispers of oral traditions, in the symbols carried by slaves across the Atlantic, in the rituals practiced by marginalized communities. The suppression of these gods could not fully erase their power or influence. They were too deeply woven into the spiritual and cultural fabric of the world. Yahweh's rise to prominence was not just a theological shift. It was a calculated cultural manipulation that sought to unify and control. By creating a singular, all-powerful God, the powers that promoted Yahweh sought to erase the richness and diversity of African spirituality, a spirituality that had been the cornerstone of ancient civilizations. But the gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer were not so easily erased. They left traces in history, in culture, and in the collective consciousness. And though their names were erased from religious texts, their power, hidden and dormant, remained ready to awaken.
Imagine opening an ancient text, its pages worn and yellowed with age, and as you read, you begin to notice something strange. Whole sections are missing, key figures are absent, and entire chapters seem to have been rewritten. This is exactly what happened with the religious texts that have shaped our understanding of the divine. These texts, whether the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, or other sacred scriptures, weren't simply written. They were edited, revised, and manipulated to create a very specific narrative. A narrative that removed the black gods from history and replaced them with a single, all-powerful deity. The concept of historical revisionism isn't a new one. Over the centuries, many religious and political powers have rewritten history to suit their own purposes. And this was especially true in the case of religious texts. In the case of the Hebrew Bible, for example, the stories that were passed down orally for generations underwent numerous revisions. These revisions weren't merely about refining details or clarifying teachings, they were about controlling the narrative. And in doing so, the histories of African gods, the gods of Egypt, Sumer, and other ancient civilizations were systematically erased from these sacred stories. But why? Why would such a deliberate effort be made to erase these gods from history? The answer lies in the power dynamics that surrounded the rise of monotheism. As we've seen, the rise of Yahweh and other monotheistic deities was not just a religious shift. It was a cultural and political one. The idea of one God, one truth, and one way of life created a unifying force, a tool that could be used to consolidate power. But in order for the singular narrative to take hold, the diverse beliefs of ancient civilizations had to be undermined. The black gods, who had once been at the center of worship and cultural identity, had to be eliminated. In the case of the Hebrew Bible, for example, stories of gods like Ra, Osiris, and Marduk, gods who were central to the spiritual lives of entire civilizations, were either silenced or twisted. In many cases, these gods were depicted as false idols or enemies of Yahweh, positioning the black gods as antagonists in a larger spiritual battle. The ancient texts were carefully edited to strip away any trace of these deities, leaving behind only the story of Yahweh and his chosen people. The manipulation of these texts was not accidental. It was a strategic move designed to erase competing divine narratives and consolidate the power of a single God. This revisionism wasn't limited to the Hebrew Bible.
It spread throughout Christian and Islamic texts as well, each shaping its narrative in ways that diminished the importance of the gods worshipped by African and Middle Eastern civilizations. The creation of a singular god was a means of religious unification, but it also served a political purpose, one that sought to control the spiritual lives of vast populations. By removing the black gods from the historical record, religious leaders ensured that Yahweh, Allah, and other monotheistic deities would reign supreme. Yet, despite this erasure, remnants of the black gods remained. These gods were not completely wiped from history. They were hidden in plain sight, in symbols, in myths, in folk traditions that persisted despite the efforts to silence them. Their influence is still felt today in the music, art, and cultural practices of African and Afro-diasporic communities. The legacy of these gods was too powerful to be fully erased, and even as their names were forgotten, their spiritual energy lived on. This is where historical revisionism becomes so dangerous. It not only erases history, but shapes the way we understand our collective identity. By rewriting the stories of the past, religious powers have controlled not only the divine, but also the cultural memory of entire peoples. The erasure of the black gods was part of this larger effort to reshape the world in a way that served the interests of those in power. But as we look at the hidden histories, the untold stories, and the symbols that have survived over time, we begin to see a different picture. A picture where the black gods are not gone, but simply waiting to be rediscovered. The truth about these gods and their role in shaping the spiritual landscape of the ancient world is far from lost. It's buried, yes, but it's still there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for us to dig deeper and uncover the secrets that have been concealed for centuries. As we move forward in this journey, think about how much history has been shaped by those who controlled the narrative. What would happen if we could reclaim these erased gods, restore them to their rightful place in history, and recognize their true power and influence? The implications are profound, not just for understanding the past, but for understanding who we are today and how we view the divine.
There's something profoundly unsettling about silence, the way it can weigh down a room, thick with history and meaning, yet somehow go unnoticed. Now picture this silence, stretched over centuries, a silence that encases entire gods, entire civilizations, and entire histories. This silence is not accidental, it is manufactured. Is the silence around the black gods, gods once worshipped by millions, whose names, stories, and legacies were intentionally obscured, erased, or ignored by the very forces that sought to control the narrative of religion and history. For centuries, the black gods were made invisible. Their stories, their names, their very existence were erased from the dominant historical narrative, replaced by the image of a singular, all-powerful God that we now recognize as Yahweh, Allah, or other monotheistic deities. The silence around these deities was not simply the absence of mention, it was an active effort to extinguish their power, to suppress their influence, and to remove them from both the spiritual and cultural consciousness of the world. But silence, as it turns out, is not forever. This deliberate silence is a form of historical suppression, a calculated move to erase the diversity of belief systems that once existed in the ancient world. By reducing the multitude of gods, each with its own rich history and role in society, to a single deity, the powers that be sought to simplify spirituality. They did not want the complexity of divine multiplicity. They wanted a single, unified God, one that could be easily controlled, propagated, and enforced. The black gods, with their deep connections to nature, the cosmos, and human life,
posed a threat to this unity. The gods of ancient Egypt, Sumer, Mesopotamia, and Africa were more than mere deities. They were forces of nature, representing everything from the sun and the moon to the elements of life and death. They were also tied to the very structure of society, guiding rulers, guiding law, and guiding the people. Ra, Osiris, Marduk, and the countless others weren't just part of myths, they were part of the daily fabric of life. And yet, over time, these gods were quietly pushed to the margins. Their temples were destroyed, their priests silenced, and their followers exiled or converted. This silence was not just about religious doctrine, it was about cultural erasure. It was an attack on the very foundation of African and Middle Eastern civilizations, a removal of their divine connections to the earth, the heavens, and the very lives they led. For the cultures that revered these gods, they were not mere figures in a story. They were the foundation of their identity. The silence surrounding these black gods also meant the suppression of entire cultural systems, from art and literature to law and social structures. The erasure of these gods was the erasure of a worldview, one that celebrated the interconnectedness of all things, where the divine was seen in the natural world and in the lives of everyday people. Yet the silence around the black gods cannot be completely maintained. As with all forms of suppression, the truth has a way of emerging, breaking through the silence like a crack in a wall, letting in light. Even though the dominant religious and political powers sought to erase these gods from history, they were not fully successful. The black gods left traces in the art, in the stories passed down through generations, in the symbols carried by enslaved Africans across the seas, and in the rituals practiced by their descendants. These gods never truly disappeared. They were simply hidden, waiting to be rediscovered by those who were willing to look beyond the mainstream narratives. As we move further into this exploration, think about the ways in which the silence around the black gods still lingers today. It's not just in the history books or religious texts, it's in the collective consciousness, the way these gods have been pushed to the periphery of our understanding of spirituality and religion. What happens when we begin to break this silence? What happens when we reclaim the gods that were lost and acknowledge their power, their wisdom, and their influence on the world? The silence around these black gods is a silence we must no longer accept. The time has come to listen to the voices of the forgotten, to hear the stories that have been hidden for too long, and to reawaken the spiritual truths that were buried beneath layers of history. The black gods are waiting to be heard, and the only question now is, will we listen?
Imagine a world where the forgotten gods of the past suddenly reappear, not in the form of stone statues or ancient scrolls, but in the lives of people today. What if these long-silenced gods, erased for centuries from history, are not only remembered, but also reclaimed in the modern world? This is happening right now, all around us, in the cultural, spiritual, and social movements of today. The rediscovery of the black gods has become a powerful force in the modern world, particularly within African diasporic communities. This resurgence isn't just about history, it's about reclaiming cultural identity, spiritual heritage, and the divine power that was stripped away by colonization, forced conversion, and religious manipulation. As more and more people look to their roots, there's a growing movement to resurrect the gods who once stood at the center of African and Middle Eastern spiritual traditions. These gods, who had been silenced and forgotten, are being brought back to life, not as relics of the past, but as living symbols of cultural pride, spiritual strength, and a deeper connection to the earth and the cosmos. In the African American community, the influence of African gods has reemerged in both subtle and overt ways.
from the reverence of ancestral spirits in traditions like hoodoo to the practice of Santeria and Vodou in the Caribbean. Elements of these ancient spiritual systems are alive and well, even though they have often been marginalized and demonized. These modern-day practices don't just pay homage to the gods, they reimagine them, giving them new life and relevance in the context of today's world. They are seen as protectors, guides, and sources of strength for people who have had their heritage stripped away but are now reclaiming it. In the broader cultural landscape, the rediscovery of Black gods is also taking shape in art, music, literature, and even popular media. Artists and musicians are incorporating symbols and themes from African mythology into their work, drawing on the imagery of gods like Oshun, Shango, and Anubis. These gods are no longer confined to the past. They are being resurrected in the vibrant, creative expressions of contemporary Black culture. This revival isn't just a reclaiming of the past. It's a celebration of resilience, a statement that the divine, the powerful, and the sacred have always been a part of the Black experience and will continue to shape it. But this rediscovery goes beyond just cultural and artistic movements. It's about spiritual awakening. Many people today, particularly within the Black community, are turning away from the monotheistic religions that have been imposed on them, seeking a deeper connection to their ancestral roots. This is a spiritual journey, a process of reclaiming lost knowledge, and a path towards rediscovering the gods who once were at the center of African spirituality. People are awakening to the fact that these gods were not just stories, they were the divine forces that shaped their ancestors' lives and can shape their lives today. This spiritual revival is also part of a larger global movement. Around the world, people of African descent are reconnecting with their roots, seeking out traditions, rituals, and deities that were once lost to them. The return of the Black gods isn't just a personal journey for individuals. It's a collective movement, a reclamation of history and identity. It's about healing the wounds of colonization, slavery, and cultural erasure, and finding a new sense of empowerment and spiritual connection. As we look at this resurgence, it's important to recognize that it's not just about nostalgia or romanticizing the past. The rediscovery of Black gods is a call to action. It's a reminder that our spiritual heritage is not lost, that the divine we seek has always been within us, and that the gods who shaped ancient civilizations are still here, waiting for us to remember them, to reclaim them as part of our shared human heritage, to honor them not as distant myths, but as living, breathing symbols of our power, our resilience, and our connection to the earth and the cosmos. And as we do, we begin to restore a sense of balance, reclaiming not just our cultural identity, but our spiritual birthright. So, what does this rediscovery mean for us today? It means acknowledging that our spiritual heritage is not lost, that the divine we seek has always been within us, and that the gods who shaped ancient civilizations are still here, waiting for us to honor them once again.
Now imagine standing at the crossroads of two worlds. One where the gods are many, diverse, and connected to the very fabric of the earth, and another where the divine is a singular, all-powerful figure, distant and separate from everything around us. This is the heart of the conflict between monotheism and polytheism, the clash between a singular, centralized deity and the rich, complex systems of belief that once flourished across the world. The monotheistic narrative, with Yahweh at its core, not only sought to replace the Black gods, but to redefine the very concept of the divine itself. Monotheism, with its emphasis on one God and one truth, didn't just alter the way people viewed spirituality, it fundamentally changed how they understood the world. Under polytheistic systems, the gods were seen as forces that influenced every aspect of life. There were gods for love, war, agriculture, and even death. Each deity had a specific domain, a role to play in the cosmic order. This pluralistic view of the divine allowed for diversity, for different peoples to worship gods that spoke to their unique experiences and needs. The gods were not just abstract concepts. They were present in everything, from the stars in the sky to the soil beneath their feet.
The divine was interwoven into the very fabric of the universe. But when monotheism emerged, it sought to simplify this view of the world. Instead of recognizing the multiple forces of nature and spirit, monotheism offered a singular, omnipotent God, Yahweh, Allah, or another supreme figure, who was the creator of all things. This shift wasn't just theological, it was political. The idea of one God served to unite people under one banner, to consolidate power under one authority. But in doing so, it erased the richness and complexity of the gods that once dominated the spiritual landscape. The emergence of monotheism wasn't a peaceful evolution of thought. It was a direct challenge to the spiritual and cultural systems of Africa, Egypt, Sumer, and other ancient civilizations. Yahweh, as the singular deity of the Hebrew Bible, represented not just a God of Israel, but the beginning of a religious revolution that sought to replace the multiplicity of gods with one powerful, controlling figure. And in the process, the black gods, who had been central to the religious life of these civilizations, were either demonized or completely forgotten. This wasn't just a theological shift, it was a cultural erasure. The polytheistic systems that had once shaped civilizations were pushed to the margins, replaced by a monotheistic narrative that claimed sole ownership of the truth. The rich diversity of African, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian belief systems was reduced to a singular vision of the divine, a vision that left little room for the gods who had once ruled the hearts and minds of entire peoples. The gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer were not just forgotten, they were deliberately excluded from the narrative of divine truth that monotheism sought to establish. Yet as we look back at the history of monotheism, we see something else emerge. Despite its efforts to erase the black gods, monotheism couldn't completely suppress their influence. The gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer did not disappear. They went underground, surviving in oral traditions, in the folklore of enslaved people, and in the rituals that persisted in the shadows of mainstream religious practice. The erasure was not total. The gods who had once shaped entire cultures were merely hidden, awaiting the moment when their stories would be retold. The monotheistic narrative, with all its power and dominance, is built on a foundation of suppression. It has told us that there is only one way to view the divine, one truth, one path to salvation. But in doing so, it has ignored the rich diversity of spiritual experiences that existed long before monotheism took hold. It has erased the black gods, the gods who had once governed the cosmos, shaped civilizations, and connected people to the divine. And it has attempted to replace them with a singular, all-encompassing God, one that is often distant and unapproachable. But what if this singular narrative isn't the whole truth? What if beneath the surface of monotheism, there is a deeper, richer understanding of the divine, one that acknowledges the multiplicity of spiritual truths, the diverse ways in which people connect to the divine, and the enduring power of the black gods? The monotheistic narrative, while powerful, is not the final word on spirituality. The story of the black gods, and the many ways in which they shaped ancient civilizations, is still there, waiting to be rediscovered. As we deconstruct the monotheistic narrative, we begin to see the cracks, the silences, and the hidden truths that have been buried for centuries. We begin to understand that the divine is not a single all-encompassing force, but a complex, diverse reality, one that includes the gods of Africa, Egypt, Sumer, and beyond. And as we reclaim these gods, we reclaim not only our spiritual heritage, but our cultural identity and our connection to the earth and the cosmos.
Have you ever looked at an ancient artifact, whether a statue, a painting, or even an inscription, and felt as though there was something more to it, something hidden just beneath the surface? Imagine uncovering a series of symbols, images, and designs that seem to point to a truth long buried, a truth about the black gods that has been obscured by centuries of historical revisionism.
What if the art and symbols left behind by ancient civilizations are not just decorative, but keys to understanding the spiritual and cultural heritage that was lost to us? The gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer were not just ideas, they were embedded in the very fabric of their societies. Their presence was felt in the physical world, in the temples, the statues, the tombs, and the walls that lined ancient cities. These gods were depicted in art, their images immortalized in stone, clay, and metal, designed not just to honor them, but to ensure their continued presence in the world. These works of art were more than just depictions, they were spiritual statements, rituals frozen in time, connecting the divine to the human experience. Take, for example, the iconic statues of Egyptian gods like Anubis, Isis, and Osiris. These figures weren't just representations of divine beings, they were thought to be vessels for the gods' power, capable of channeling their energy into the world. The very act of carving these statues, of painting their images on tomb walls or temples, was an invocation of their presence. These gods weren't meant to be static or distant. They were intended to be active participants in the lives of the people. In the art of Sumer and Mesopotamia, the gods were depicted not just as human-like figures, but as beings of immense power, often shown in larger-than-life proportions, emphasizing their divine authority. Marduk, the Babylonian god of creation, was depicted as a towering figure, often shown defeating monsters or bringing order to chaos. His image wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a representation of the forces of creation and destruction, the very laws of the universe in visual form. But these images, these symbols, have not always been seen for what they truly are. Over time, as monotheism took root, and the black gods were pushed into the shadows, these symbols were misinterpreted, decontextualized, or simply erased. Temples and statues were destroyed, their meanings lost. And as the stories of the gods were replaced with a singular narrative, the deeper understanding of these divine figures was obscured. Yet these symbols have a way of surviving, of finding their way into the modern world. If you look closely, you can still find traces of these ancient gods in the symbols we use today. The use of the Ankh, the symbol of life, continues to appear in African American culture as a powerful representation of spiritual resilience and strength. The Eye of Horus, an ancient Egyptian symbol of protection and wisdom, has been adopted by various cultures as a symbol of insight and spiritual awakening. In fact, ancient symbols are experiencing a resurgence in modern art, fashion, and spirituality. These symbols are being reinterpreted, given new life, and reconnected to the black gods who once embodied them. The symbols of African, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian gods are being reclaimed, not just as historical relics, but as powerful emblems of cultural identity, spiritual pride, and ancestral connection. The art that once honored these gods is now being rediscovered as a source of empowerment, a way to reconnect with a past that was deliberately erased. This rediscovery of ancient symbols is not just about nostalgia for the past. It's about reawakening a spiritual legacy that was suppressed for centuries. It's about recognizing that these gods were not mere myths. They were the very foundation of ancient spiritual and cultural systems, and their influence extends far beyond the confines of history books and dusty museums. The symbols that once represented these gods are part of the living, breathing legacy of African and Middle Eastern spirituality. As we begin to decode these symbols, we see that they tell a story that has been lost to time. They reveal a connection between humanity and the divine that transcends the boundaries of religion, culture, and history. These symbols are a bridge to understanding the complexity and richness of ancient belief systems. and they offer us a way to reconnect with the gods who were once central to our spiritual and cultural identity. The power of these symbols is not just in their history, it's in their ability to connect us to something deeper, something ancient, something divine.
Imagine the deep psychological impact of being told that your heritage, your spiritual identity, and your divine connection to the world were all false, that the gods you once revered, the beliefs that once guided your ancestors, were nothing more than myths, illusions to be replaced by a new, singular truth. The erasure of the black gods wasn't just an act of historical or cultural suppression. It was a psychological blow to millions of people, one that reverberates through generations, leaving a scar that is still felt today. For centuries, people of African descent, particularly those who were displaced through slavery, colonization, and forced conversion, have lived with the psychological effects of having their gods erased. The very foundation of their spiritual identities was dismantled, replaced by foreign beliefs that were not their own. In this process, the black gods, gods who had been central to the spiritual, social, and cultural lives of African civilizations, were made invisible. The psychological trauma of this erasure is profound, as it challenges the very notion of identity and belonging. To be told that the divine is not found in your ancestors' gods, but in the foreign deity imposed upon you, is to be disconnected from your roots, your history, and your sense of self. This erasure was not merely a religious shift. It was a tool of psychological manipulation. By removing the black gods from the equation, those in power sought to break the connection between the people and their divine ancestry. Without a connection to their gods, people were left adrift, searching for meaning in a new religious system that often viewed them as inferior or lesser. This psychological dislocation led to a loss of cultural pride, a fractured identity, and a deep sense of spiritual disempowerment. But the effects of this erasure aren't just confined to history. They continue to echo in the present day. For generations, the descendants of those who were forced to abandon their ancestral beliefs have struggled with a sense of spiritual fragmentation. The disconnect between the gods of their ancestors and the gods they were forced to adopt creates a psychological void, a sense of not fully belonging to either world. This feeling of spiritual exile is something that continues to impact people today, particularly in the African diaspora. The erasure of the black gods also reinforced the idea that African people were not spiritually advanced, that their religious practices were primitive or backward. This false narrative, perpetuated by colonial powers and the spread of monotheism, sought to justify the subjugation of African peoples by painting their spiritual systems as inferior. The psychological damage done by these falsehoods runs deep. It instilled a sense of spiritual inferiority, leading people to question the validity of their own culture, beliefs, and history. But as we look today at the resurgence of interest in the black gods through art, music, spiritual practices, and academic research, we begin to see the psychological healing that comes with reconnecting to these ancient deities. Reclaiming the black gods is not just an act of cultural preservation, it is an act of spiritual healing. It's about restoring pride, power, and identity to a people who have long been told their spirituality was not worthy. By reconnecting with these gods, people of African descent are not just reclaiming lost history, they are reclaiming their sense of self, their spiritual power, and their divine connection to the universe. The psychological impact of erasure can never be fully undone, but the process of spiritual reclamation is a powerful form of healing. By acknowledging the existence and importance of the black gods, we begin to reverse the psychological damage caused by centuries of suppression. This process allows individuals to rebuild their spiritual identity, reconnect with their cultural heritage, and embrace the divine power that was always theirs. This psychological healing isn't just an individual journey, it's a collective one. As more and more people turn to the black gods for guidance, strength, and inspiration, they are also healing as a community. The spiritual awakening that accompanies this process is not just a return to ancient beliefs, it's a reclaiming of power, a restoration of pride, and a reawakening of spiritual strength that had been buried under layers of oppression and erasure. The journey to healing is long, but it begins with a simple acknowledgement of the black gods, their power, their presence, and their importance in shaping the spiritual and cultural identity of African peoples. By bringing them back into the light, we take the first step towards healing the wounds of the past and restoring the spiritual integrity that was lost. The black gods are waiting for us to remember them, and in doing so, we begin to remember ourselves.
Imagine for a moment living in a world where the very essence of your identity is questioned, where your culture, your beliefs, and your gods are dismissed as inferior or unworthy. This was the reality for many African peoples, particularly during the era of slavery and colonization, when their spiritual systems were not only suppressed but deliberately replaced by foreign belief systems. The black gods, once revered and central to the cultural and spiritual lives of African civilizations, were erased in an effort to destroy cultural identities and reshape entire societies. But this cultural erasure was not without consequence. It sparked a powerful and ongoing struggle for cultural identity that continues to this day. The struggle for cultural identity is a fight for the right to exist in a world that has long tried to erase the uniqueness and value of African heritage. For generations, black people were taught to reject their gods, their traditions, and their heritage in favor of foreign systems of belief that denied their divinity and worth. This forced cultural assimilation, a systematic erasure of spiritual and cultural practices, left deep scars on the collective psyche. It wasn't just the loss of gods, it was the loss of a connection to history, to ancestry, and to the deep spiritual traditions that had once been the foundation of life itself. But as with all attempts to erase a people's identity, there is a fierce and powerful resistance that rises in the wake of such destruction. The struggle for cultural identity, particularly in the African diaspora, is a reclaiming of what was lost. It's a reclaiming of the gods who were once revered as powerful forces of creation, justice, love, and strength. It's a fight to restore the divine to its rightful place within African communities and to reintegrate the black gods into the spiritual and cultural consciousness of the world. The resurgence of interest in the black gods is not just a nostalgic return to the past. It's a reclamation of power and pride that was stolen through centuries of colonization and religious domination. As more and more people, particularly those of African descent, rediscover the significance of these gods, they are also rediscovering their cultural identity. They are reconnecting with the divine forces that were once central to their ancestors' lives, and in doing so, they are reconnecting with a deeper, more authentic version of themselves. This reclamation of the black gods is also a rejection of the notion that African spirituality is primitive or inferior. By reclaiming these deities, black people are asserting that their spiritual systems are just as valid, powerful, and meaningful as any other. This is a profound challenge to the narrative of spiritual superiority that has dominated the world for centuries. A challenge to the very idea that monotheism is the one true path to salvation. The black gods are a reminder that there was once a time when African spirituality was not only respected, but was the center of thriving, sophisticated civilizations. At the heart of this struggle is the desire for spiritual autonomy, the right to define one's spiritual life on their own terms. For too long, black people were told what to believe, told which gods were worthy of worship, and told that their ancestors' gods were false or inferior. The reclaiming of the black gods is an act of defiance. It's a way of saying that black people have the right to worship the gods of their ancestors, to connect with the divine in their own way, and to honor the deities who shaped their cultures and communities. This cultural struggle is not limited to religious practices alone. It is about the full reclamation of Black identity in every form, cultural, social, and spiritual. It's about taking pride in the rich heritage that was nearly lost and rebuilding a sense of self-worth and spiritual empowerment. The Black gods are central to this process because they represent the very heart of African cultural identity. They are not just gods, they are symbols of resilience, resistance, and survival. They are the divine forces that have persisted through the trials of colonization, slavery, and cultural suppression. For the generations who were taught to reject their gods, reclaiming them is an act of defiance. It's a way of saying that the story of Black people is not one of victimhood, but one of strength, survival, and spiritual depth. It's a way of showing that despite the efforts to erase Black culture and history, the divine forces that once guided African civilizations are still here, still powerful, and still ready to lead their people forward. The reclaiming of the Black gods is not just a spiritual act, it's a cultural revolution. It's about restoring pride in African identity, in African spirituality, and in the divine forces that have always been a part of the African story. This journey is one of self-discovery, spiritual empowerment, and cultural vitality. As the Black gods are brought back to life, so too is the culture that they once sustained. And in that process, the true strength of African heritage is restored to the world.
Picture the stirring moment when someone finally remembers who they are. They see themselves clearly, reconnecting with a part of their identity that was forgotten, hidden, or erased. This is the moment of spiritual awakening, a moment when the Black gods are not just remembered, but re-embraced. This movement, which has been quietly building in the shadows for years, is now coming to light. It is not only a rediscovery of ancient deities, but a restoration of the soul, an awakening of spiritual power that has been dormant for too long. For too many generations, the spiritual practices of African peoples were treated as inferior, dismissed, or actively destroyed in favor of foreign belief systems. But today, across the world, there is a growing recognition of the power and significance of the Black gods. This movement is not just about religion, it's about cultural reclamation. It's about acknowledging that these gods are not relics of the past, but living forces that continue to shape the spiritual and cultural lives of millions. This spiritual awakening is not confined to one region, one group, or one community. It is a global movement, especially within the African diaspora. From the Americas to Europe to Africa itself, people are awakening to the fact that the gods who once ruled their ancestors' worlds are still relevant today. These gods are being reintegrated into the modern spiritual landscape, not as outdated idols, but as symbols of empowerment, wisdom, and ancestral connection. The resurgence of interest in Black gods is part of a larger spiritual restoration, a movement aimed at restoring the spiritual autonomy that was taken away through colonization, slavery, and religious domination. For too long, Black people were told to reject their ancestral gods, to adopt foreign beliefs that did not resonate with their true selves. The spiritual awakening happening today is the direct response to that erasure. It is a reclamation of identity, a return to the gods who were stolen from them, and a recognition that these gods are not only valid, but powerful and transformative. This movement is more than just a spiritual revival. It's a profound form of cultural and personal healing. The Black gods, once forced into silence, are now speaking again, calling people back to their roots, back to the deep spiritual traditions that were suppressed for centuries. People are turning to these gods for guidance, strength, and protection, reclaiming not just their spirituality, but their sense of self. It's a process of healing wounds that have been inflicted over generations, wounds that were caused by the systematic erasure of cultural and spiritual heritage. But the restoration of these gods is not just about healing personal wounds, it's also about healing the collective trauma of entire communities. When people reconnect with their black gods, they are not just reclaiming a piece of their spiritual past, they are restoring a sense of pride, dignity, and unity. These gods are not distant deities. They are deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of black communities, and by reconnecting with them, people are reestablishing their place in the spiritual and cultural world. In this spiritual restoration movement, the black gods are not just figures of worship, they are symbols of resilience, resistance, and survival. These gods have stood the test of time. They have survived the attempts to erase them, and now they are returning to guide their people forward. The spiritual awakening that is taking place today is a recognition that these gods are not just ancient relics, they are alive, vibrant, and active in the lives of those who seek their wisdom and protection. The spiritual movement is also about reclaiming power. It's about rejecting the narrative that black spirituality is inferior and asserting that African gods have always been at the center of the divine. By re-embracing these gods, people are taking back the power that was stolen from them, reasserting their right to connect with the divine on their own terms, and rejecting the spiritual systems that have long sought to control and oppress them. As this movement grows, it will continue to inspire others to reconnect with their own ancestral gods and spiritual practices. The spiritual awakening that is happening today is just the beginning. It is a call to reclaim lost wisdom, to heal deep wounds, and to reestablish a divine connection that has been denied for too long. The black gods are coming back to life, and their power is once again being felt in the world. So if you feel drawn to these gods, if you feel a spark of recognition, know that you are part of something much larger. You are part of a global movement that is not only reclaiming ancient traditions, but also reawakening a divine power that has been dormant for centuries. The black gods are coming back to life, and their power is ready to lead us into a new era of spiritual empowerment, healing, and cultural restoration.
Now, think about the lasting impact of ancient traditions on modern spiritual practices. Imagine how, despite centuries of cultural erasure and suppression, the spiritual legacy of the black gods continues to shape the lives of millions today. These gods are not just remnants of the past. They are alive in contemporary spiritual practices, deeply embedded in rituals, ceremonies, and belief systems that have stood the test of time. Even in the face of centuries of colonialism, forced conversions, and the rise of monotheistic religions, the influence of the black gods is undeniable. In today's world, the black gods have returned, not as forgotten relics, but as living symbols of power, strength, and resilience. They continue to inspire and guide people across the globe, particularly within African diasporic communities. From Santeria and Vodou in the Caribbean to Candomblé in Brazil, the gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer are still worshipped, revered, and celebrated. These spiritual practices, which have often been misrepresented and misunderstood, are living testaments to the enduring power of the black gods. In these spiritual systems, the black gods are not distant, unattainable beings. They are present and active, involved in the lives of the people who honor them. They are called upon in times of need, in moments of celebration, and in daily rituals that keep the connection between the divine and the earthly realms alive. The gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer are invoked for protection, guidance, healing, and empowerment. They are seen not as abstract concepts, but as real, living forces that influence every aspect of life. The practice of invoking these gods is also a powerful statement of cultural pride and spiritual autonomy. By honoring these ancient deities, practitioners are not only reconnecting with their spiritual roots, they are reclaiming the right to worship in a way that feels authentic and meaningful,
This is especially significant for those whose ancestors were forcibly converted to Christianity or Islam, as it is an act of spiritual resistance, a refusal to accept the religious systems imposed upon them. In the modern world, the black gods are also making their way into mainstream consciousness. Artists, musicians, and writers are drawing inspiration from African spirituality and the gods who once ruled the ancient world. From hip-hop to visual art, the symbols and stories of these gods are being woven into the fabric of modern culture. These deities are no longer confined to the realm of ancient history. They are alive in the art and culture of today, influencing everything from fashion to social movements. This cultural revival of the black gods is not just about reclaiming the past, it's about reimagining the future. These gods, once silenced and erased, are now being invoked to inspire social justice, empowerment, and spiritual healing. In the face of modern struggles, from racial inequality to environmental degradation, the black gods are being called upon to help guide the way forward. Their ancient wisdom and teachings offer a roadmap for navigating the challenges of the contemporary world, reminding us of our deep connection to the earth, to each other, and to the divine. The legacy of the black gods is also alive in the healing practices of today. Many of these deities are associated with healing, both physical and spiritual. They are called upon for assistance with everything from mental health struggles to physical ailments. In many ways, the practice of honoring these gods offers a form of spiritual therapy, an opportunity to heal the wounds that have been inflicted by centuries of oppression and spiritual dislocation. The black gods are not just figures of power, they are also symbols of hope, offering healing and transformation in a world that often feels fractured and broken. This revival is not limited to religious practices alone. It's part of a larger cultural movement to reclaim and celebrate black heritage and identity. As people rediscover the black gods, they are also rediscovering the richness of African history, art, language, and culture. This spiritual restoration is a key part of a larger process of healing, one that allows people to reconnect with their roots, reclaim their power, and move forward with a deeper sense of purpose and identity. The legacy of the black gods is one of resilience, transformation, and spiritual depth. Despite centuries of suppression, these gods are returning to guide us, to remind us of our inherent power, and to help us heal. In today's world, the black gods are not just figures of the past. They are living forces that continue to shape our spiritual practices, our art, and our culture. They are the embodiment of our strength, our survival, and our continued journey toward spiritual liberation.
As we reach the end of this journey, I want you to pause and reflect on everything we've uncovered: the hidden gods, the erased history, and the spiritual revolution that is unfolding before our very eyes. What started as a whisper of forgotten truths has grown into a loud, undeniable call. The black gods are not gone. They were never truly erased. They were suppressed, obscured, and hidden from sight. But their power and presence have always remained beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. The journey to reclaim these gods is not just an academic exercise or a search for ancient artifacts. It is a spiritual and cultural awakening, a recognition that the divine has always been a diverse, multifaceted force, not confined to a single monolithic deity, but alive in the many forms that have shaped human history. The black gods, who once ruled the spiritual and cultural worlds of Africa, Egypt, Sumer, and beyond, have much to teach us today. They offer us a different way of seeing the divine, one that is more inclusive, more connected to the earth, and more attuned to the natural rhythms of life. In reclaiming these gods, we are not only restoring spiritual power to the black community, but to the world at large.
These gods are part of humanity's shared heritage, and their wisdom can guide us as we navigate the complexities of the modern world. From social justice to environmental activism, the ancient teachings of these gods offer profound insights into the interconnectedness of all things and the importance of balance and harmony. This is a call to action. The black gods are waiting for us to remember them, to reawaken their power, and to integrate their wisdom into our lives. But this isn't just about worship, it's about transformation. The gods of Africa, Egypt, and Sumer were not just symbolic figures. They were active, dynamic forces that shaped the world and its people. By reconnecting with them, we reconnect with the power of our ancestors, with the wisdom of ancient civilizations, and with a more authentic spiritual path that resonates deeply within our own souls. The erasure of these gods has lasted for far too long, but we are at the threshold of a new era, one where we, the descendants of those whose gods were stolen, have the power to bring them back into the light. This is not just a spiritual revival. It is a cultural renaissance, a reclaiming of what was always ours, a spiritual revolution that will echo through the generations. As you leave this journey, think about the spiritual inheritance you carry. Consider how these gods, these divine forces, can guide you in your own life, and what their return means for the world around you. The erasure is over. The time to restore the black gods is now. So, are you ready to continue the journey? If what we've uncovered tonight has caused you to rethink everything you knew about religion and spirituality, don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Let me know how you're feeling about these long-hidden truths. And don't forget to like this video so the message reaches others who are also seeking answers. This journey is just beginning, and if you want to continue exploring these deeper, often suppressed truths, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. The next revelations might just change the way you see the world, and I want you to be the first to hear them.